The Bulldog choke. Ben Askren made his long-awaited UFC debut at UFC 235 against former welterweight champion Robbie Lawler. It was one of the most anticipated debuts in UFC history, fueled by Askren's undefeated record and his reputation as a relentless grappler. The fight opened violently. Lawler picked Askren up and slammed him on his head within the first 10 seconds. What followed was a sustained, punishing barrage. Lawler landed heavy ground and pound, cutting Askren and nearly finishing the fight early. Many observers believed the bout could have been stopped in that opening sequence. Referee Herb Dean allowed it to continue. Askren recovered and initiated a clinch, slowly dragging the fight into his world. Within moments, he secured a bulldog choke, an uncommon submission from a front headlock position. As Askren applied pressure, Lawler's arm appeared to go limp and drop toward the canvas. Dean interpreted the movement as a loss of consciousness and immediately stopped the fight at 3:20 of the first round, awarding Askren a technical submission victory. Lawler immediately protested. He stood up, alert and animated, insisting he had not gone out. Replays showed that just before the stoppage, Lawler had given a clear thumbs up to Dean, indicating he was still conscious and defending. The controversy centered on Dean's angle. He may have missed the signal. At the post-fight press conference, Lawler clarified, "Herb checked on me, and when he checked, I gave him the thumbs up. I put it down, looked right at him, and I was like, hey man, if ass I'm good. He's a hell of a ref. He just made a mistake." Dean later defended the call on the Joe Rogan Experience, noting the spine-bending pressure of the choke and how Lawler's limp arm suggested he was going out. The MMA community erupted. Analyst Damon Martin tweeted, "Yeah, upon replay, Herb Dean blew that one," while Luke Thomas added, "That is a really bad stoppage from Herb Dean." Popular fighter Aljamain Sterling described it as a shitty way to end a debut fight. Despite widespread calls for a rematch, including from fans and analysts, the UFC never rebooked the bout. The result stood as a submission win for Askren, though the legitimacy of the outcome remained disputed. The tap that wasn't. In March 2015, Drew Dober stepped into the octagon in Rio de Janeiro, looking to build momentum in the UFC's stacked lightweight division. Opposite him stood Leandro "Buscape" Silva, a well-rounded Brazilian grappler with the home crowd behind him. Midway through the second round, Silva latched onto a guillotine choke during a scramble. It was tight, briefly, but Dober kept calm, worked through the pressure, and began to escape. His body posture rose, head slipping from danger, seconds from freedom, then inexplicably the fight was over. Referee Eduardo Herdi waved it off, declaring Silva the winner by submission. Dober hadn't tapped. He hadn't gone out. He was actively defending, in motion, mid-escape. Confusion swept through the arena. Commentators called it instantly a massive mistake. Dober stood up, arms outstretched, asking the obvious question, what just happened? The criticism was immediate. UFC commentators Daniel Cormier and John Anik called it one of the worst stoppages they'd seen. Social media erupted. Fighters, fans, and media all demanded the call be overturned. Dober filed an official appeal. A few days later, Brazil's Athletic Commission did something rare. It agreed. The bout was overturned to a no contest. One of the few times in UFC history a referee stoppage was publicly acknowledged as an error and reversed. Silva's win was erased. Dober's loss never counted, but the damage lingered. The botched call stole a clean performance from both men. Silva's submission was tainted. Dober's momentum stalled. For referee Eduardo Herdi, it was the first of several high-profile missteps. His credibility never fully recovered. It was a stoppage without a signal, a tap that never came, and a moment where the fighter's skill was clear, but the referee's judgment wasn't. The nightmare debut. UFC 267, Abu Dhabi. Benoît Saint-Denis walked into his UFC debut unbeaten, unproven, and ready to make a name. Across from him stood Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos, a dangerous, explosive veteran with real knockout power. The first round was competitive. Saint-Denis started strong, trading kicks, clinching early, and looking to impose his grappling. But the edge and experience was clear. Dos Santos began picking him apart with clean combinations and body kicks that slowed Saint-Denis down. By the end of the round, momentum had fully shifted. Saint-Denis, bloodied but composed, made it back to the stool. What followed in round 2 was one of the most brutal brutal non-stoppages in recent UFC history. Dos Santos came out sharp and ruthless. Head kick snapped the Saint-Denis guard apart. Right hands landed flush. Knees found the body. The Frenchman was trapped against the fence, barely moving his head, eating dozens of unanswered shots. He was still standing, but only barely. Referee Vyacheslav Cuțelaba watched and said nothing. The commentary booth began pleading for the fight to be stopped. Paul Felder called it irresponsible. Daniel Cormier shook his head. The UFC's own broadcast, rarely critical of officials, was unanimous. This was a failure. Saint-Denis tried to survive in the clinch. He threw back, but it wasn't enough. Dos Santos kept pouring it on, and Cuțelaba kept watching. Then came the illegal groin strike, clear, brutal, and met with no pause in the action. Saint-Denis doubled over. Cuțelaba ignored it. By the end of round 3, Dos Santos was awarded a clean sweep on the cards. But the fight itself was no longer the story. Dana White had Cuțelaba pulled from the rest of the event. His decisions weren't just questioned, they were condemned. Fighter safety had been compromised. Saint-Denis returned months later, earned his first UFC win, and proved he belonged. But his debut will always be remembered for what didn't happen, a stoppage that never came, and for 10 minutes in Abu Dhabi, the cost of an action nearly became irreversible. The tap that never happened. It was UFC's return to Japan in 1997, a special one-night heavyweight tournament designed to showcase both local talent and international names. In the opening round, Kazushi Sakuraba, relatively unknown at the time, was matched against Marcus Silveira, a massive Carlson Gracie-trained black belt and a clear favorite. The size difference was dramatic. Silveira weighed in at 243 pounds. Sakuraba, barely over 180, was competing 2 divisions above his natural class. Few gave him a chance. Seconds into the fight, Silveira charged forward, landing a flurry of strikes. Sakuraba was knocked backward but immediately shot for a single leg takedown, grabbing at Silveira's hips. As the crowd roared and the flurry continued, referee John McCarthy stepped in, waving the fight off, believing Sakuraba had been knocked out. He hadn't. Sakuraba was conscious, actively shooting, and visibly protesting the stoppage as it happened. Replays confirmed the mistake. McCarthy had misread the motion, mistaking a tactical drop for a collapse. It was one of the earliest high-profile referee errors in UFC history. The bout was ruled a TKO victory for Silveira, but confusion reigned. Backstage, discussions erupted. With the tournament structure still intact, officials made a decision. Sakuraba would get a rematch later that night. It was rare, almost unprecedented, but the mistake was too clear to ignore. Hours later, they met again in the finals. This time, Sakuraba took Silveira down, controlled the action, and locked in a fight-ending armbar at 3:44 of round 1. He won the tournament. On the mic afterward, Sakuraba said simply, "In fact, I am a professional wrestler." The reversal marked the beginning of his legendary run, but the night also stood as a warning. Early officiating errors weren't just plausible, they were inevitable. One rushed call almost erased one of MMA's most iconic figures before he ever began. The EYEPOKE TKO. On July 19, 2008, Anthony "Rumble" Johnson faced Kevin Burns in what would become one of the most controversial finishes in early UFC welterweight history. It wasn't the stakes or the skill level that defined the fight, it was the officiating. From the opening round, Johnson, known for his power and speed, began dictating the pace. Burns, a last-minute replacement, had a weapon of his own, a persistent, open-handed lead that repeatedly found its way into Johnson's eyes. Throughout the fight, multiple eye pokes were landed, visible, damaging, and clearly affecting Johnson's performance. By round 3, the damage had escalated. Johnson had already been poked in the eye several times, yet no point was ever deducted. Then midway through the round, it happened again. Burns extended his fingers directly into Johnson's right eye during an exchange. Johnson immediately collapsed to the canvas, covering his face and unable to continue. Referee Steve Mazzagatti didn't call a foul. He ruled it a TKO victory for Kevin Burns. It was a baffling conclusion. Johnson was incapacitated not by a legal strike, but by an illegal move that had been warned about earlier in the fight. His corner erupted in protest. Johnson was later diagnosed with a detached retina, an injury serious enough to threaten a fighter's career. The decision stood. Mazzagatti cited that he did not see the eye poke in real time and believed it was a legal strike. Despite immediate backlash from media and fans, the result was not overturned. Johnson filed an appeal with the Nevada State Athletic Commission, suspension. The commission denied it, stating that unless there was evidence of intentional misconduct or a rules violation acknowledged by the referee, the decision would remain. The controversy didn't fade. Analysts criticized Mazzagatti for his lack of control and failure to recognize repeated fouls. Even UFC president Dana White openly questioned his judgment. 5 months later, the UFC booked a rematch. This time, Johnson ended it decisively, knocking Burns out with a head kick in under 4 minutes. Justice came late, but the damage was already done. The late stop on July 11th, 2012, rising middleweight contender Chris Weidman faced Mark Muñoz in the main event of UFC on Fuel TV4. For Weidman, it was a critical step toward title contention. For Muñoz, it was a comeback fight, his first in nearly a year, and a chance to extend a 4-fight win streak. The fight was one-sided from the outset. Weidman controlled the action on the ground early, threatening submissions and dominating position. Muñoz looked flat, tentative, and increasingly outclassed. Then came the second round, and the elbow that changed everything. As Muñoz lunged in with a looping right hand, Weidman slipped it and countered with a perfectly timed standing elbow. The strike landed flush, dropping Muñoz to the canvas. Weidman immediately followed with ground and pound, hammering down a barrage of heavy, unanswered shots. Muñoz lay on his side, arms limp, face defenseless. Referee Josh Rosenthal stood just feet away and watched the assault continue. At least 15 clean punches landed after Muñoz was clearly unconscious. Broadcasters began yelling. Cageside journalists stood up. The crowd fell into stunned silence as Muñoz absorbed unnecessary punishment. Finally, Rosenthal stepped in. By then, Muñoz's face was bloodied and swollen. Weidman walked away clean. The official result was a knockout victory at 137 of round 2, but the real story was the delay. Rosenthal, typically a respected official, had hesitated far too long. Commentators and fans were united in their criticism. UFC veteran Kenny Florian tweeted that the stoppage was disturbing. Dana White later acknowledged the error, calling it a late one. Even Muñoz himself admitted post-fight, all athletes are counting on that referee to keep you safe. The physical toll was evident. Muñoz was never quite the same. He went 2-3 in his next 5 fights and retired in 2015. For Weidman, the performance earned him a title shot against Anderson Silva, a fight that would define his career. But on that night in San Jose, one referee's delay cast a shadow over a career-making win. The self-refereed submission. It wasn't the UFC, it wasn't even a major promotion, but what happened at TACHI Palace Fights 9 in 2011 became one of the most surreal and viral referee blunders in MMA history. Chad George, a bantamweight veteran known for his grappling, was facing Mark Vorgeas. The fight progressed methodically. George worked his wrestling, gained dominant position, and eventually set up a Von Flue choke from side control, a rarely seen submission that counters a guillotine when the opponent holds on too long. As George applied pressure with his shoulder, pinning Vorgeas' neck while trapping the choking arm, he felt the shift immediately. Vorgeas had gone out, unconscious, limp. The choke had done its job, but the referee didn't see it. George looked up, paused, and told the official, "He's out." The referee, standing just feet away, shook his head. "No, he's not." George repeated it, calmly, clearly, "He's out." Only then, with George standing over his unconscious opponent, did the official walk in and wave off the fight. It was a rare moment where a fighter was forced to stop his own bout and protect his opponent because the referee failed to recognize a clean finish. George, visibly frustrated, walked away from the scene more confused than celebratory. The fight became an instant talking point across MMA media. Clips were shared widely online. Not for the technique, but for the officiating failure. Analysts noted that the Von Flue choke, while uncommon, was a legitimate and established submission. A trained referee should have recognized the signs of unconsciousness, the limp limbs, the fading movement, the lack of defense. The incident was used in training seminars for years afterward as a textbook example of what not to do as an official. The fakeout that fooled the referee. On February 29, 2020, light heavyweight contenders Jan Cuțelaba and Magomed Ankalaev squared off at UFC Fight Night, Benavidez vs. Figueiredo in Norfolk, Virginia. The matchup promised fireworks. Cuțelaba's aggression against Ankalaev's precision. It delivered a flash of controversy instead. Just seconds into the opening round, Ankalaev connected with a high kick and followed with a series of punches. Cuțelaba began swaying and backing up, his hands low, head movement exaggerated. To many, it appeared he was playing possum, faking vulnerability to bait Ankalaev into overcommitting. To referee Kevin McDonald, it looked like Cuțelaba was out on his feet. At just 38 seconds of round 1, McDonald stepped in and stopped the fight. No knockdown, no collapse. Cuțelaba immediately protested, springing toward the referee in disbelief, arms raised in frustration. The MMA community erupted. Analysts and fans alike criticized the decision. UFC commentator Dominic Cruz called it one of the worst stoppages I've ever seen. Social media trended with calls for a rematch within minutes. Cuțelaba's team filed an official appeal with the Virginia State Athletic Commission. It was denied. The result, Ankalaev by TKO, was upheld despite the widespread backlash. UFC President Dana White voiced his disapproval but didn't overturn the outcome. The organization instead rebooked the fight for April, then August, and finally October due to pandemic-related delays. When it finally happened, Ankalaev ended the debate decisively, winning the rematch by first-round knockout. Still, the original fight remained infamous. The fight became a clear example of what happens when a referee mistakes showmanship for distress. Cuțelaba lost a fight he was still very much in, and with it, a piece of his momentum. Cuțelaba tried to play the matador, wobbling like a man on stilts to lure his opponent in. The referee thought he was actually on stilts. One fake stumble, one real misunderstanding, and suddenly we had the fastest magic trick in UFC history, a TKO out of thin air. The early stop at UFC 314, held in Miami on April 13, 2025, veteran featherweight Dan IG faced rising prospect Sean Woodson in a pivotal main card matchup. IG, known for his power and grit, came into the bout looking to reassert himself in the division. Woodson, tall and unorthodox, sought the biggest win of his career. Through the first 2 rounds, the fight was competitive. Woodson used his reach, landed jabs and body shots, while EJ pressed forward with counters. It was a close, measured contest. Neither man in clear control. That changed early in round 3. IG landed a left hook that staggered Woodson. As the younger fighter backed toward the fence, EG unleashed a flurry. Hooks, uppercuts, short hammer fists. Woodson covered up but remained standing. His guard was high. He shifted, absorbed shots, and appeared to be moving his head as he weathered the storm. Then referee Andrew Glenn stepped in. The fight was stopped at 112 of round 3. TKO for Dan IG. Woodson immediately turned to protest. His eyes were clear. His hands were still up. He hadn't gone down. He hadn't stopped defending. Moments later, replays confirmed the sequence. Woodson had been hurt, but never dropped, and never appeared out of the fight. The backlash was swift. On commentary, Joe Rogan called it one of the worst stoppages I've seen in years. Daniel Cormier echoed the sentiment, saying Woodson was defending. That fight should have continued. Fans online flooded the broadcast with reactions, most siding with Woodson. Even Dan E.G. in the post-fight interview admitted he was surprised by the call. There was no appeal, no reversal. The result remained a TKO win for IG, but the controversy lingered. For Sean Woodson, it was a night where surviving the storm wasn't enough. For Andrew Glenn, it was a decision that erased the line between protecting a fighter and denying him a chance to fight back. It wasn't malicious, it was fast. Too fast. And in a sport where every second matters, one moment of overcorrection turned a live contest into a premature ending.